Hello, a very warm welcome to all of you. This is Dr. Manisha Mirdha, and today I would be speaking on the topic Democracy, History of an Idea. There are going to be two parts of this topic. Today we would be speaking on part 1. So, the first thing that we need to understand is what exactly is democracy. Yes, we know that this is a very central idea, very central to any theorizing of politics or government or state in modern times. As you can see, it says it serves as a cornerstone for modern societies, promoting individual rights, fostering social progress and ensuring government accountability. In today's lecture, we will try to explore the meaning of the word democracy, then we will get into the definitions of this word democracy, the origin and roots of this concept of democracy. Then we will try to look into the key features and characteristics of democracy, forms of democracy, emphasizing its significance as a system that upholds the ideals of equality, liberty and justice. So, to begin with, I would like to start with this, that democracy is a very widely used term, and everything in the contemporary era is associated with this term democracy, because democracy is supposed to be something which is very virtuous, something very good. So, all the states necessarily align themselves with the idea of a democratic state. But what is democracy? That is the most interesting thing for us to understand. And before I get into the history of this word democracy, I would also like to mention something which happened currently. Democracy was among the threads that ran through the speech when the leaders of the two nations met recently in Washington and shared democratic values between India and United States of America, the world's largest democracy and the world's oldest democracy. The word democracy was mentioned something like 14 times in this entire series of conversations that they had over there. Of the various things which were mentioned of the term democracy, it said that the beauty of democracy is the constant connect with the people, listen to them and feel their pulse. So, this is a very important conception of state, but at the same time this is a very contested concept. Democracy is a very contested concept. It is not easy to define. Democracy has been described as an essentially contested concept because it is one of those terms scholars can never agree on how to define, because the definition itself carries with it a lot of social, moral and political agendas. Now, why is it a contested concept, and why is there this debate amongst the scholars regarding the understanding of the term democracy? See, there are situations where undemocratic states, there are situations where complete military regimes also declare themselves as democracies, because as I said, it is very virtuous to be considered a democratic state, but the kind of governance that they have is not something anywhere closer to the idea of democracy. So, it is a very challenged concept, it is a very contested concept, and people have been applying different interpretations to this word democracy. So, to begin with, let us try to look at the origin of the word democracy. Roots can be traced of this word from ancient Greece. Democracy is generally associated with the efforts of ancient Greeks. It is derived from the Greek word demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule. So, it is a form of governance which is something which empowers the citizens and makes them participate in the decision making process. I would now go into some of the definitions which have been given by the scholars of this area. One of the definitions which was given by Herodotus, which says democracy as that form of government in which the supreme power of the state is vested in the hands of the community as a whole. So, this definition gives us that idea about the state where the governance is actually in the hands of the people at large. The rule is with the people at large. The second definition is by Abraham Lincoln, one of the most celebrated, one of the most repeated definition of democracy, which is very largely and very widely used, is that democracy is a government of the people, by the people and for the people. And this gives us a very clear understanding of what democracy must be. At the same time, it also gives us that challenge whether democracy is all about this. This is something for us to understand in the coming slides of our lecture. Then there has been a definition by Lord Bryce which says, democracy is that form of government in which the ruling power of the state is vested not in any particular class or classes, but in the members of the community as a whole. So, this definition is also putting a lot of emphasis on the rule of the people, on the authority of the people who take charge of the governance of the entire state. We will be dealing with 3 more definitions which will give us this entire spectrum of idea of this word called democracy. Mazzini says democracy is the government of the best and the wisest for the progress of all and through all. This definition naturally gives us this idea that democracy is something which is for the benefit of the people at large, benefit of all the people at large of the state. Professor Seeley says democracy is a government in which everyone has a share. So, it is not just because in a monarchy the stake is of the monarch, in an aristocracy the stake is of a select few people, but in a democracy the entire community's interests are at stake. So, therefore, his definition, I repeat, democracy is a government in which everyone has a share. And then finally, a definition by A.V. Dicey which says democracy is a form of government in which the governing body is comparatively a large fraction of the entire nation. So, this is also something which is coming close to our idea of the rule of the community at large. Now, we will try to look into the evolution of the concept of democracy. Democracy has a very long and ancient history. I mean, till now we also I think we have an understanding of democracy that it is something which talks about the power of the citizens and their decision making process. As I said, it has a very long and evolving history, and there have been various interpretations and various implementations of this word democracy. The roots of democracy can be traced back to ancient Greece, specifically to the city-states of Athens in the 5th century BCE. Athens is often regarded as the birthplace of democracy, where the concept of demos, which is having a say in the affairs of the state, took shape. However, it is important to note that the democracy in ancient Greece was limited to a small portion of the population. The Athenian democracy was a direct form of democracy where eligible citizens gathered in the assembly to debate and vote on legislative matters. They also selected individuals to serve in various positions, which could be the magistrates, the military commanders, through a process of sortition or election. So, when we are attributing this entire evolution of this word democracy to Greece, we also have to understand that the Athenian democracy was a direct form of democracy. What exactly is direct democracy is something which I will be elaborating in my coming on slides, but it is right now for starters, it is a direct form of democracy where eligible citizens gathered in the assembly to debate and vote on legislative matters. However, the Athens in which the birth of democracy had taken place was actually not a true democracy. Now, you might wonder why it was not a true democracy, because the kind of democracy which prevailed over the city states in Greek, they did not include the participation of women. Women were not allowed to vote. The slaves were not allowed to vote. The foreigners were not allowed to vote. So, their kind of participation in democracy was very limited. This is not what our true understanding of democracy is. So, therefore, we cannot regard Athenian democracy as true democracy, because it was not inclusive. It did not include the entire participation of the community, which we had been mentioning in our definitions. So, therefore, it was a very limited understanding of democracy which prevailed in Athens. So, when is it that the true understanding of democracy began? The true understanding of democracy is something which can be traced back to the Magna Carta. Magna Carta was issued in 1215 and was the first document to put into writing the principle that the king and his government were not above law. It sought to prevent the king from exploiting his power and placed the authority by establishing law as a power in itself. So, therefore, Magna Carta was one of the first step towards the creation of true democracy. It was a milestone in British law in creating the constitutions of various countries also. The Australian constitution has been inspired from the Magna Carta. The American Revolution has been another milestone in the understanding of democracy. The American Constitution actually starts with the phrase "we the people." The legitimizing authority of the state has been placed with the people, and there are certain rights of the citizens which are protected in the Constitution. So, therefore, the American Constitution is another milestone in the understanding of the word democracy. The writings of philosophers such as John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Paine played a very significant role in shaping modern democratic understanding or modern democratic thought. These thinkers emphasized the right and liberties of individuals, the social contract between citizens and their government, and the idea that political power should ultimately reside with the people. So, we can see how the writings of Locke, Rousseau emphasized on the rights and liberties of people and gave a better understanding of what democracy is. The American and the French revolutions in the late 18th century were watershed moments for the establishment of modern democratic systems. The United States and its Constitution and Bill of Rights became a model for representative democracy, blending elements of direct democracy and a system of elected representatives. But the actual form of democracy flourished in the 19th and the 20th century, and the concept of democracy spread further, because it was influenced by movements of suffrage, civil rights, decolonization, and many countries adopted a democratic form of government. Obviously, the degrees of success and democratic principles differed amongst them, but the idea of democracy in its totality was flourishing in. Post World War II developments, most of the populations of the world or the rulers claimed to be democratic. A very eminent scholar, David Helt, has written extensively on the concept of democracy and the evolving nature of democratic practices in the contemporary world. He emphasizes on certain ideas of democracy, and to name a few of those, he talks about cosmopolitan democracy, he talks about democratic accountability, he talks about deliberative democracy, multi-level governance, democracy and globalization. So, David Held has been a prominent political scientist and an academician who has contributed a lot in the political theory of the understanding of the term democracy. John Donne also gave his expression on democracy when he says that every nation wants to be a democratic nation now. This is a very legitimizing idea. So, as I previously mentioned, nations which are not even democratic in totality, nations which could be something like military junta, were also claiming themselves to be democracy. However, democracy remains the most prevalent form of government worldwide, and its practice and implementations differ significantly across nations. Different models of democracy exist that we will be talking about in our next lecture. Right now, to mention, there are parliamentary democracies, example is our own country India. There are presidential democracies like United States of America, and there are constitutional monarchies like the UK, each with its own variation and each with its own adaptation. So, having dealt with these definitions and the meaning of the term democracy, I hope by now we have a fair idea of what democracy means. So, after gaining a fair understanding of what democracy possibly means, let us also look into different aspects of democracy. Democracy is a procedure also, and democracy can be an ideal also. Now, what is the difference between democracy as a procedure and democracy as an ideal? Democracy as a procedure would entail or include things like free and fair elections, rule of law, constitution, political parties. The existence of these mandates makes it to be a procedure. These are the procedural aspects of a democracy. However, democracy is not limited to a procedure itself. Democracy is also an ideal. Democracy is also a guiding principle. Democracy is more than a system of rule. Democracy is something that you internalize. It is something which is difficult to conceptualize, but till you do not believe in the guiding principle of democracy, the ideal of democracy cannot be fulfilled. So, therefore, democracy as a procedure with its clear mandates, but democracy is also a guiding principle, and both go hand in hand. Democracy to flourish requires it to be understood both as a procedure and as a ideal. So, therefore, it is very important that the holistic understanding of democracy is absorbed for us to proceed further. Having talked about democracy as a procedure and democracy as an ideal, I would also like to differentiate between these two terms which are quite often used but have very different meanings: democracy and autocracy. Now, democracy, as we have said till now, is something which protects the rights of the people. Democracy is something which has a procedural and a substantive concept to it. Autocracy is what? Autocracy is something which is a rule of the dictator or rule of a few people, a rule of a select few people, but definitely not by everyone. So, democracy is something which inherently involves the community at large and the rule of the people of the state. However, autocracy is something which is involving less amount of participation, less amount of involvement, and has that inherent aspects of command, hierarchy, obedience, less or no participation, and loyalties. So, if I just go back to the previous slide, Democracy is something which has rules of law, has procedures, participation and rights, whereas autocracy would have aspects of command, hierarchy, obedience, less participation and loyalties. After having differentiated between autocracy and democracy, I would also like to talk about two broad parameters of democracies: direct democracy and indirect democracy. Direct democracy is something which is also known as pure democracy, something which Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked about very frequently. And in direct democracies, the citizens participate directly in the decision making process, which means that they can vote directly, opine their views directly, be a part of the policy making directly, which is not so in indirect democracies. Indirect democracies are representative democracies. Most of the nations which are democratic nations are based on indirect democracies. If I had to differentiate between direct and indirect democracy on the basis of the bullet points seen on the slide, I would say if the difference between direct and indirect democracy by definition would mean direct democracy is a system where citizens vote directly on laws and policies, whereas indirect democracy is something where citizens elect their representatives who would then take decisions on the part of the citizens. The citizens do not directly participate in the decision making process. If I had to differentiate between direct and indirect democracy on the basis of participation, I would say all citizens in a direct democracy get to participate in the decision making, whereas the participation of all the citizens in indirect democracies is not there. The speed of decision making in a direct democracy is comparatively quite quick, whereas the speed of decision making in indirect democracy takes a lot of time. So, decision making in indirect democracies is a long process. And yes, in direct democracies, the decision making might be less complex, whereas in indirect decision making or indirect democracies, the decision making gets more complex. So, this was the difference between direct and indirect democracies. If you would want to know that do we actually have any direct democracies now? Yes, there are. In fact, in our own country, when we talk about the Gram Sabha in modern times, that is an example of direct democracy. Otherwise, largely all the states, be it our own country, be it United States of America, Canada, are all indirect democracies. However, Switzerland, where they have the system of referendum, becomes an example of direct democracy. So, yes, there are direct democracies also prevalent in today's time, but they are very few in number. So, this was the difference between direct and indirect democracies, and I would also like to quickly mention about the procedural and substantive form of democracy. Procedural democracy is something with its centering of electoral processes as the basis of democratic legitimacy, which is often contrasted with the participatory democracy, or what is also called the substantive democracy, which centers on equal participation of all groups in society in the political process as the basis of legitimacy. So, finally, in our lecture, I would like to wrap up the discussion by pointing out certain fundamental principles of democracy that we have mentioned till now and the benefits of democracy. If I talk about fundamental principles of democracy, the first fundamental principle of democracy which we have gathered till now is popular sovereignty, which would mean what? that democracy is largely in the hands of the people. Democracy talks about rule of law, which means that the same laws apply for all the people of the land, be it the government officials, be it the office bearers, all have to face the same rules of law. It is very consistent. So, the meaning of rule of law is that everybody follows the same fundamental principles of survival. The third fundamental principle of democracy, as seen on the slide, talks about protection of individual rights. So, democracy inherently upholds the dignity of freedom and liberty. It protects the individual rights and it safeguards the expressions, free press, the kind of religion that you would like to follow, the kind of associations that you would want to be a part of. So, the protection of individual freedoms and liberties is taken care of in democracies. And finally, pluralism and inclusivity. So, democracy as a system appreciates and encourages involvement of all the citizens, irrespective of their background, irrespective of their caste, creed or whichever gender that they might belong to. It is a very inclusive concept, it is a very pluralist concept. So, these are some of the basic fundamental principles of democracy. Having said this and having mentioned the term democracy as a very challenged and debated concept, as a very contested concept, we might wonder whether there are any benefits of this kind of a system. Yes, democracy does offer numerous benefits, numerous advantages which contribute to the welfare of the people, the well-being of the people. To name a few of the benefits of democracy, one is protection of civil liberties. So, it empowers citizens to express their opinions freely. Peaceful expression of your opinions is something which is welcomed in democracies. Another benefit of democracy would be governmental accountability. So, the process of regular elections ensures that people keep a check on the governmental accountability. Governments are answerable to the people because it is the people who have been responsible for them being the representatives of the citizens of the state. Another benefit of democracy is social stability, because democracy provides the avenue for peaceful expression of opinion, because democracy provides that platform for people to express their opinions freely. It also ensures that there is a social stability in the system, because if this was not there, if this expression freedom was not there, then that kind of stability which a state requires would be at stake. But in democracies, that social stability is to a very large extent ensured. And last but not the least, economic prosperity. So, democratic systems ensure that the economies of the nations flourish and people have a substantial economic independence. It encourages free markets, it encourages the protection of property rights, and economic growth and prosperity are the virtues of democracies. So, therefore, these are some of the benefits of democracies. We might also wonder that a concept that we have challenged right from the beginning, does it not have any demerits? It does, but we will save the demerits for the next lecture on democracy. So, for today's lecture, the learning was, first of all, we tried to understand what democracy is and the various definitions of democracies. It is true that the democracy definitions were at times very different and gave a very contested meaning, but that is the beauty and the irony of the term democracy. After understanding the definitions of democracy, we tried to locate the origin and the roots of the term democracy, after which we tried to gain an understanding of the terms called substantive democracy, procedural democracy. We tried to understand the difference between direct democracy, indirect democracy. We also tried to understand the difference between democracy and autocracy. And in the end, we wrapped up the entire discussion with pointing out the few conclusive specifications of the term democracy along with its benefits. We will be discussing the challenges in the coming lecture. Thank you.